Okay. So why can't I retire? If you were to make $70,000 today, so you're making $70,000 a year today, and 10% of your income is going into an account, so $7,000 a year, and that account is growing at 10%. So you're taking $7,000 a year and you're putting it into an account that makes 10% annual return, and you do that for 30 years. Let's say you're 35 now and you're going to retire at 65. 3% inflation. Now, the amount that you save is equal to inflation as well. So you make 7,000 the first year, the next year is going to be 7,000 and some change, and so on. Now, I didn't do the whole chart, but I want you to look. Here's 65 years old. At 65 years old, you've saved 35,572. So you've saved over $2 million, putting away $7,000 or 10% of your $70,000 a year and making a 10% return. So in 30 years, you've made $2 million. But check this number right here out, 191. Enough money to match your $70,000 a year income 30 years from now is now 191,000. So if today you're making 70,000 and 30 years from now you want to have today's equivalent of 70,000, you're now taking out 191,000. You're not taking out 70,000 a year. And so $2 million just got a whole lot smaller. Now, if you look at the 20 years that I've got you living before you run out of money, 65 to 85, if you're taking out that the equivalent of 70,000 a year, enough to live off of, your account continues to earn 10% every single year, you will run out of money in 20 years. And when I say run out of money, you're taking $335,000 a year out of your savings account to make your $70,000 a year lifestyle. Are we tracking?
Is that because, are you saying that's just with the inflation rate every year going up?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Inflation. People don't understand it, and they don't realize that they are on a treadmill that's moving very, very fast, going the opposite way as them. So you've got some terms. I'm going to hit them really quick. Inflation is the slow growth of money. So people say inflation is prices going up. It's in truth, even though that makes sense and it works in your brain, we are losing money. So our value of our dollars is going down. It's not prices just going up. It's actually the value of the dollar is going down. Disinflation. We are luckily currently in a stage of disinflation. Inflation rarely, if ever, goes down. What we're saying is the inflation is not as bad as it was yesterday. Disinflation means it's still going up, but it's going up slower than it did. Core inflation. Inflation is based on CPI. We're going to hit that in a minute, but it's a basket of goods. It's just they take the price of a bunch of different things that most common households have, and they figure out how much all those things cost, and they put a number to it. And that's your CPI, and that's how they manage or they check inflation or cost of living. Core inflation gets rid of a couple of the ones that they don't have as much control over, such as gas. You know, gas prices go up, this president down, next president, war, all these different things affect gas prices. So sometimes they'll take them out to determine what inflation is because gas is not a good measure. Stagflation. This is what happens when people are losing their jobs and the price of the dollar is going down. It's normally the opposite. Normally when people don't have a job, your prices aren't going up, they're going down. And usually when everybody has a job and they're fighting to get a job, that's when inflation happens. So stagflation is kind of the opposite. It's a negative. It's a bad thing because your money is losing dollars, but the people in society are not, the economy is not getting better. So normally in inflation, everybody's making more money and therefore the value of the money goes down. Stagflation is when people aren't making more money and the value is still going up. Deflation is when it actually starts to go down. So let's say everybody's prices get up too high and so they decide to start backing them down. Otherwise people can't buy them. Quantitative easing is when the government puts money into the markets, into circulation. By increasing the amount of money that's in circulation, businesses therefore have more money, right? Because they were given money by the government. However, when you have more money, what does every dollar now have value-wise? There's less. So the way inflation, the way prices or value goes down is they put too many in, so the supply and demand is affected. You no longer have as big of a demand for the dollars because there are more of them, and therefore the value of them goes down. So it's good to understand inflation. If $1 million was enough to retire today, which it's yet to be decided if we could retire today off $1 million, but if you're not retiring today, you're going to retire in 30 years. This is the formula. If you wanted to figure out how much money today would be in 30 years. So this is what $1 million would be worth in 30 years. 308,318. So if you had $1 million 30 years from now. So right now we're talking about investing. You get really excited. You say, I'm going to set a goal. Brett, I've got this. I'm going to do it. I'm going to set a goal. I'm going to have $1 million when I retire. And I retire at 65. It's going to be 30 years from now. I'm going to have $1 million. And so you start working towards your $1 million goal. You start doing that 10% paying yourself, not 20. You do 10%. You're like, I got this. I got $1 million. You got to understand that when you hit your $1 million, 30 years, when you go to that financial planner and he shows you a portfolio and he says, if you do this, you'll have $1 million when you're whatever age you're trying to retire. You have to know that that is only $308,000 by the time you're there. Now, if I was to tell you you have $308,000 today, could you retire? If 308 is not enough to retire today, then $1 million is not enough to retire in 3 years. Now, I'm going to kind of walk you through how I got that, and then we're going to move on to some real estate stuff. CPI, Consumer Price Index, is used to measure inflation. We've got this really interesting graph. This is the CPI data over the last, 100 years, over 100 years. And right here in 1970 is when the United States went off the gold standard. The gold standard controlled the amount of money that existed because it was attached to a value. So you couldn't put more money into circulation because you could only have as many dollars as you had gold. So it worked really well to back the money off of gold. But in the 1970s, they decided to change that. And as you can see, you have a little bit of an increase over the last 50 years. The red lines are recessions, but we're not going to hit those in this class, so I'm not even going to mention them. So is the interest in the inflation, is that compound or simple? You guys remember?
Looks like compound.
It looks like compound, that's right. So if I was to put it right over this graph right here, this is the one we used last week. This is the compound interest graph. So the red one is a, cool. The red line is your simple interest. It's linear. And the light blue line goes right along with our current inflation rate. So it is compound interest. Now we talked about, that's that really good stuff, right? So we talked about the penny, and we talked about Benjamin and Sebastian and how they made $2 million by putting $16,000 away in the first couple of years. And then remember that? Inflation's doing the exact same thing. It's throwing back that $2,000 and it promises you it'll be worth $2 million in the future. So that's why we have to kind of keep an eye on it. Now, what I did, let's see how I did this. Because I don't want to take the whole class on it. Yeah. If you did y'all get my email with the attachment?
I was looking at it right before, and I don't know that I saw the attachment.
That's okay. And I'm gonna put this in there later. This is an equation that we really need to know. You can write it down. We're going to work on it a couple times in this class. It's for your benefit. It's not necessarily gonna, yeah, we'll hit it. This is your CAGR, your compounded annualized growth rate. So if you were to, I've got the example here. If you were to buy an investment today for $1,000 and sell it 12 years later for $4,200, what was your annual growth rate? So when we look at a bank and a bank has a 6% or a 3% or a 1% interest rate, that is annual. And so we get really comfortable saying the annual, one time a year return that something costs. But what happens when we do investments that extend over an annual period? Like in this case, it was 12 years and he made $4,200. So how much was his actual return? If you just look at the net return, you would say that he had a 320% return. But since it was over 12 years, we can say that he had an annual growth rate of 12.7. So now we can compare this investment of $4,200 earning to, let's say, a bank's interest rate. We can compare them and say, okay, this is probably 2 to 3 times what a bank would give me on this investment. So that's what we use CAGR for. So when we do real estate, if you think about it, if you buy a house today and you sell it 15 years from now, you want to know what your total growth was, right? Now, I used this exact same formula to figure out what our inflation rate was. So over the last 50 years, we went from 38. Like I said, I'm going to go really quickly through it. So if you're trying to do the math with me, you're going to get a little behind. So you got 258 and 38. So in this case, you would take 258 plus the 38 divided by the 38 to the 1 to the 50th power minus 1. And what you get, oh, there it is. You get a 4% growth rate. So inflation is 4%. What are banks? We talk about the high yield interest rates, and CDs are what? Anyone remember from the last class? They're about 5. The high interest rates are 5. Most banks are in the 2s or less. If your checking and savings account are probably 1 or less. So money in a bank account barely, if at all, fights inflation. Do you see this? So if you're not at least saving your money, you have no money. It's going backwards. And this isn't even debt. So if you were trying to have $1 million 30 years from now, we already talked about what $1 million today equals 30 years from now. If you wanted to have $1 million, you would have to have 3,243,397. So if you wanted to set a goal today that you wanted to retire with $1 million when you're 30 years from today, you would need to shoot for 3 million, not 1 million, in order to have the same amount of money as $1 million would buy you today. But what if you retired in 2020? A lot of people retired in 2020. How was inflation in 2020? If you do the same math for this section right up here, this is from 2020 to now. So December 2023. January's numbers aren't in yet. 29.8% inflation. 29.8%. So if we run the math, if you retired in 2020 with $1 million, you made it, you set your goal, and you just had normal earnings, you just kind of had a bank account with $1 million in it. 3 years later, you now have 456,000. You now have $500,000 in 3 years. And you didn't lose it in the stock market. You didn't lose it in a bad deal, a bad investment. You didn't lose it like a theft or someone stole your identity. You lost it because inflation. It literally ate it. So as we talk about these numbers, I can't stress the importance of learning the value of earning money. And we talked about how sometimes people are like, oh, I shouldn't try to be rich, or being rich is bad, or I shouldn't think about being rich. Rich isn't enough. At this point, we have to understand that rich isn't enough. And if you were a millionaire 3 years ago, you are now a $500,000 today for no other purpose than the inflation that ate it all. And we're not going to be able to stop inflation. And I'm not assuming that inflation is going to stay at that rate forever. There are tools that the government uses to get rid of it. However, I will tell you that if it did, let's say hypothetically, inflation stayed at 29% for 30 years, and you want to retire in 30 years, how much money would you need to have the equivalent of $1 million? The answer is $2,536,658,225. $2.5 billion if inflation stays the way it is. Now, that's borderline hyperinflation, and it happens. There are countries that do that. We're not political. I'm not going to talk about who did it and what did it and why it happened, but you want to make sure that you are earning a decent return over whatever inflation is. Now, what's important to understand about inflation is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And we've heard that before. Rich have assets. Assets increase in value, but they're not really appreciating. They're going against inflation. So as the dollar gets less, then a thing that they're holding, the asset, is theoretically worth more of the same worthless dollars. So if you own a house, whether it be your own house or you owned real estate, rental property, when 2020 happened, 2021 happened, and we had 30% inflation, you may have seen the value of houses go up similarly to the rate of inflation. Now, what we said was, oh, look at the housing market, boom, look at the prices going up and all that appreciation. That wasn't appreciation. That was a hedge against inflation. Those houses stayed the same value, but the dollars went down in value and more dollars to buy the same house. So the way we see it is we have more money. If you owned a house in 2020 that was worth $100,000, it might now be worth $200,000. You may have doubled your money in 3 years because you held something that was an asset. Now, it didn't really double. It didn't become more valuable. The dollars that held it were less, but we look at it as increased price. Tracking? This is why the rich buy assets, because inflation isn't going anywhere. And so we want to understand how to stay ahead of it. So buy things that will go up with it. These are, if I give out this slide deck, these are something you can use. These are some of the calculators that I wish I knew before I did all the math. There are these pretty cool calculators. You got a retirement calculator, inflation calculator, investment calculator, and a mortgage calculator. If you go to calculator.net, you'll find a ton of them. You can play around with them if you're ever interested. But the calculations on this slide deck and the ones in the packet are also, they also work.